Hello and welcome to another episode of Analysts Bar, episode 6. Yes, that's right. We've made it to episode 6. Of course, it's myself, Richard Agando, and again, my partner in crime, Colin Sisson. Hi, Colin. How are you?
Not so bad, mate. Yourself?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Good. Had a good week. Do anything last night?
I did. Yeah. I managed to get out and watch some football, which, like I say, I think it's just a sense of how excited we all are for kind of, the freedom to go and watch our clubs and that sort of stuff. So I took the opportunity to go down to Baseford last night. We were playing Mansfield, a selection of kind of first team pros and younger players and stuff. And like I say, great occasion. Baseford's a club that's very close to my heart, having played right from, I think I was under 11s all the way through to first team at the time. I have to say the first team pitch didn't quite look like as it does now when I played. Okay. When I played first team for Baseford. But like I say, fantastic club and a great occasion, a great spectacle, really. There was some Notts links. Alex Howes was playing central midfield, Declan Dunn as well, who, I watched with a little bit of interest, really, because, he was someone who caught my eye a little bit, technically quite gifted as a midfielder, but probably lacking that kind of assertiveness as you would expect from a young pro. But he seems to have built that into his game at Baseford and was really getting stuck in. So that was a fantastic aspect to it. But I have to say as well, anyone who was there at the game would agree with me. Tyree Sinclair for Mansfield Town stood out above all the players. Played incredibly well. Not just because he scored 2 goals, and it isn't just because of that. He won the free kicks that led to the goals that he scored, but also just playing in that position where he's just dropping off the forward line, finding those pockets, technically very gifted. And I tell you what, the thing that probably impressed me the most is he took an awful lot of whacks, kicks and pushed off the ball and, dispossessed. He hit the deck loads of times. But you know what? He took it. Not only did he take it and give the best kind of revenge that you can do by obviously sticking 2 free kicks back, in the back of the net, past Adam Collin. I have to make the point. For the other Notts links, but also, like I say, he exacted that kind of professional revenge that you want to see. So didn't lose his temper, but just let his football do the talking, and he orchestrated the game both halves, really, for me. So he was a really impressive player to watch, and only 20 years old as well. So Mansfield have got a good player there.
Oh, okay. What about young Jimmy? Did he get some minutes, Jimmy Knowles?
Yeah, he got a lot of minutes. I think it was a tough one for him, to be honest. And I think that frustration started to spill out a little bit. Okay. So he was playing on that kind of right-hand side of the attack that we're quite used to him seeing. And again, those fundamentals that we're used to seeing, that pace, for example, really trying to open that up. But a few little heavy touches, didn't really get him into the spaces that he wanted to. And you could tell that it was irritating him a little bit. Obviously a lot of physical contact as well from Baseford's defenders and stuff who would have been very much aware of the threat that he posed. And I think that they managed his game quite well. But like I say, Tyree Sinclair just pulling the strings in that game for me.
Okay. So that's someone we'll have to keep an eye on then as well this season. So moving on then, episode 6. We're going to be talking a lot about transfers in, out, ones we've got, ones we missed out on, etc. And there's been a few goings on as well off the field at Notts, hasn't there? In particular, there was a job advertisement went up a few days ago. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've not quite got my CV in just yet.
No.
Like I say, fantastic. I mean, like I say, you see the job as first team coach, and that was the title of the job advert, and you could quite easily miss it. But actually, it was the content as you move further down that Notts are looking essentially for someone who can help them maximise set pieces, and that's a fascinating aspect, particularly for a National League club. I'm aware that I know we talk about Brentford an awful lot in terms of data and analytics, but I do know that Brentford were one of the first to maximise that, and I think they even had a throwing coach at one point. And then Liverpool started to tap into that as well. So for us at National League to be looking into those, and I think we've talked about it on previous pods as well, and I've talked about it in other shows as well. Set pieces in the National League are huge, really, in terms of there are some teams who solidify their league position purely on their ability to take really good free kicks or to defend them incredibly well. So for not to be looking at these kind of finer margins, because obviously we're going to talk in quite a lot of detail about the transfer policy and about the quality that Notts have got in their squad, but them finding, it's that innovation, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? It's that innovation. That's the thing that's really exciting, and you know, the owners and the whole club really, you know, including Ian Birchnell, who we'd imagine would have had a say in the fact that he wanted this to be part of his coaching staff. You know, deserve an awful lot of credit for thinking this way, and hopefully it'll be celebrated in you know, in the whole of football, really, for seeing a club really sort of trying to not necessarily accept their position, but trying to kind of move beyond it.
I think they're building a great platform, aren't they, for the future with what they're doing with the structure at the club. You know, you can see the thinking's very advanced, and you know, when you're talking about bringing in a coach to look at those finer details and everything, and how small the margins are, you can see how important that is. And I suppose that goes along as well with the other announcement, well, not an announcement by Notts, but obviously something that came out in the press this week about the video analytics that they are now using from BPro.
Yeah, I mean, again, a fantastic story that, like I say, came out from other avenues, didn't it? Really, you know, I became aware of it, and I retweeted it on our Twitter page as well once I found it sort of late last night after coming in from the Baseford Mansfield game. You know, to reiterate what we were saying, it's about innovation. You know, it's about forward thinking, and for the club to look at their stadium, which obviously we know that Meadow Lane is a fantastic venue, but for them to be able to add that capacity in of that live video analysis that can be accessed directly, that can give, you know, different perspectives, different viewpoints on the match. I mean, you know, to digress a little bit, one of the things that we talked about, Rich, when we were allowed to go back in stadiums is we started to sit in slightly different places at Notts, didn't we? You know, in terms of, like, you know, those who typically went in the cot may have had to have found themselves in the family stand or whatever. Even seeing a game from a slightly different perspective, you know, from a slightly different angle, gives you a different viewpoint on a particular player, about their movement, about their attitude, you know, those sort of things. So to have this kind of 360-degree opportunity to look at the game and to have access to all of that live, I mean, it's just phenomenal, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what interests me about this as well is that, and this is only my own thought, it might be nothing at all, but to me, it's almost like it's got Ian Birchnell written all over it as well, because, you know, with him, coaching's been his career, but not just coaching, but using all of the tools that are available to him. He's been quite open about that in previous interviews. You know, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's had a big input into this. I could be wrong, but I just get the feeling that maybe he did.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I go back to probably Notts' statement when they controversially, you know, removed Neil Ardley and brought in Ian Birchnell, and the owner's statement was we can be better. And I think quite a few people thought about that in terms of just the footballing performance on the pitch, but actually is quite an encompassing statement, really, about the whole infrastructure of the club, and about obviously the brand, if you like, that they wanted Notts County to be. And I agree with you. You know, you need a head coach, and you need someone who's going to be embracing those things, because otherwise you just get that disconnect. And there's clubs up and down the country that have got really ambitious owners, for example, who perhaps haven't got the manager who wants to implement those, or doesn't see the game in the same way. So I hope this is another sort of indication of the kind of the harmony that's going on in the background. And, you know, we've got a group of people who want to not only move the club forward, you know, in terms of performances on the pitch, but also the technology and the infrastructure behind it.
No, absolutely. So that all bodes well then. It'll be interesting to see how that starts to work for us, and if we can start to see the benefit of that and the new coach and everything else that's going off once the season starts. So we really wanted to have a look at some of the transfers, didn't we, in this episode? Have a look at who's come in, 2 or 3 of those that we've probably missed out on, that we'd identified, or should I say you'd identified previously, and who else is still around who might fill a couple of holes for us. So, you know, we had quite a good, it seemed a bit slow at first, and we were thinking, oh, blimey, why haven't we signed anybody yet? But then all of a sudden, things suddenly looked quite rosy quite quickly, didn't it? You know, starting off with Kyle Cameron, of course.
Yeah, what a player to start with, you know, in terms of a statement of intent. You know, and you've done some fantastic analysis in terms of, you know, his Y-Scout data and stuff, which we'll get onto. But I think it's been, again, we've talked about the kind of the harmony. You know, there'll be plenty of players with very similar data, but we've not only brought a player in who is young, I think has got the trajectory to go from National League into the Football League, as he, you know, quite honestly stated that he had options already in the Football League. But then it's also about bringing that squad together. You know, we've got Karl Robinson as well. They seem very close from their time at Newcastle, which is fantastic. He knows a few of the lads as well who've been brought in as well from Torquay. And also, I think it's significant that he's worn the captain's armband a couple of times as well. So
yeah, very interesting.
There's a kind of, for that to be your first transfer, as well as the fact of the amount of very angry tweets from Torquay fans. You know, there's been. It was a great way to start, wasn't it? It was a great way to set the tone of the transfer policy.
No, definitely. And I'm just going to bring up on the screen now a few stats for Kyle here. Obviously, these are just stats for last season. So any stats that we'll be showing tonight for the players that are coming will be just purely for last season, so that we get a fair analysis. But yeah, if you have a look at that there, he's it's not just about his defensive duels, which obviously you'd expect to be quite high, but his ability also to put an accurate pass together, and not just an accurate pass, but also, you know, an offensive type pass, you know, looking forward. So 62% accurate forward passes there from a sort of centre-back role. Now, I know that last season he played a few games maybe down the left and probably in a bit more of an advanced role, and even had to go up top, I think. But, you know, it just goes to show that he's going to add a little bit of something extra for us that maybe we haven't had recently in that back line.
I think that came through loud and clear, certainly I bought the stream for the Boston game, and you could see that element of his performance coming through loud and clear. You know, this ability to take the ball forward and to do that. I think also as well, you know, and I was thinking about this when you know, obviously we've talked how we're both kind of becoming more au fait with stats and analysis and stuff. And I played as a goalkeeper as a kid, and one of the things that I remember one of the coaches talking to me about was the fact that sometimes the very best goalkeepers don't necessarily need to make the most dramatic saves because their positioning is really good. And so the sliding tackle data can look quite low for a centre half. You're thinking, oh, hang on a minute, you know, we're looking at someone, you know, in terms of the sliding tackles and the successful sliding tackles. But actually, you know, you need to think about whether he needed to do them, whether they were they sliding tackles that were more blocks, do you know what I mean, or were to take a player off course, rather than actually a sliding tackle with its first and main aim to win the ball. And so that got me thinking also about kind of that data that we've got there. Someone could look at those successful sliding tackles and kind of 57% suggesting that he wins just about over half of them. But actually, the sliding tackles that the data picks up as not being successful might actually have been slightly defensive blocks, or kind of you know, beckoning someone out wide and preventing them from having a chance at goal. So it's always interesting to question the data as well. But I mean, the data plus what we're seeing in terms of the pre-season games really does form an impressive picture.
No, definitely, and you know, I'm excited to see how that works out with Cameron. I started to scroll through a few video clips just to see what he was about, really, and one caught my eye when I was looking through on my Y-Scout account, and something that I think we can look forward to with him is like you say, that positional play and being able to get a block in or a sliding tackle is great. But it's not just that. I think it's going to be his ability to win that challenge, but not just finish with winning the challenge. Make sure that once that challenge has been won, that ball is making its way up to the front line as fast as possible. And I'm just going to share a little clip with everybody now that kind of shows this. Hopefully I've got it in the right place. I don't know, but here we go. On the front foot straight away, and I think we're going to see a lot of that, and with our wing backs as well coming into it, and with the likes of the midfielders that we've got coming in as well, I think it's going to create quite a formidable attack from defence. If the other guys that are playing in that, which we now know is most likely going to be a back three, can sort of pick up some of those tips and some of that play, it certainly bodes well for the club next season.
Totally. And like I say, that's what pre-season's all about, isn't it? It's about players understanding that they can anticipate that. And with the players that we are going to talk about later on, slightly higher up the field, who we've brought in, the hope is that we've got players who have got the capability to move that ball successfully and accurately further up the pitch as well. So yeah, absolutely fantastic first signing.
Yeah, excellent. Then Frank Vincent, which is probably a bit of a shock to everybody, wondering, where's this guy from? But again, a good footballing pedigree. Obviously, come through the ranks at Bournemouth, and has played some, to decent level at other clubs. Still very young. And you can see there, accurate passes again is his best stat for last season. But even so, he's not afraid to put himself about a bit looking at that. He's confident that he can dribble with the ball. He's happy to get stuck in with his defensive duels. And his passes into the final third, according to that, and this is just for last season, are not a bad representation of his game at all there.
Yeah, and we talked about kind of the Notts recruitment dilemmas at the tail end of last season, about having to replace Michael Doyle and the amount of forward passes that he did, being that standout player in the National League. And we talked about how Notts may not necessarily need to find one player to replace all those forward passes, but actually it's about spreading those forward passes around. And so we've talked about two players now who are capable of winning it and playing it forward and making sure that ball progresses on. I must admit, there was one thing. I'll hope other Notts fans have found this, and like I say, if he's listening, I apologise for taking the mickey slightly. I don't know if anyone saw his interview when he first signed, but he must say the word buzzing about 15 times. Right. And I thought that was quite a nice metaphor for the videos that I've seen of him, because he is full of energy. Yeah. We've not seen him yet on the pitch in terms of pre-season, but I was able to see some show reels, which obviously, like I say, you should take show reels with a pinch of salt. But he is absolutely all over the place in terms of closing players down, and the speed and the accuracy of his passing and those sort of things. So I think that might be a little nice kind of metaphor for the player that hopefully we've recruited and we'll see more of soon.
Absolutely. So. Next up, then, Joel Taylor from Chesterfield.
Yeah,
do we think he's a direct replacement for Kelvin Miller, or do we think he's better than that?
Oh, that's an interesting one, because I like Miller. I did like Miller, so much so that I was very upset that Chesterfield signed him and suggested that we signed the lad who they ended up signing literally like an hour after as a form of retribution, which created me to some infamy on Chesterfield and Chesterfield's Twitter. So looking forward to the game when we play them. But no, it's interesting, isn't it, that we as a club, like I say, I don't want to necessarily suggest that we were completely in control of this and we chose Taylor over Miller, for example, but it does kind of, we paid a fee. We must have obviously wanted him, so much so that we wanted to bring him in. I've been impressed with what I've seen of him. In terms of athletic energy and athleticism and power, got an awful lot of that. Playing against a Boston side who are not to be sniffed at, really. In fact, he was came up against Matt Tootle, quite regularly in that preseason, and I think he came off the victim more often than not. Gets up and almost becomes an auxiliary winger. I know we were used to with that with Miller, but I think it's more natural pace and power. I think with Miller, there was an awful lot of trickery that came off more often than not, but also got him into trouble. And I can imagine if you're wanting that ball to progress on, if you're wanting that ball to move, it could be quite frustrating to see moves broken down sometimes. If you're progressing down the left, your left-hand side player, which Miller did occasionally do, brings it back inside or tries to take a player on, loses it, and then suddenly you're being countered. And in fact, I think that's how Torquay scored one of their goals. So it may have been something along those lines, that actually we were looking for someone a little bit more direct, who wouldn't necessarily take those opportunities to kind of cut inside or try and beat a man, but actually it's about using that pace and power to really break the lines, get it forward, and then get the ball into the box. Absolutely. And into those danger areas.
Well, I need to apologise because I've just realised that Joel's stats was one that I didn't upload to the podcast, but it will be available. Just to point out to everybody as well, again, if they go on the website, analystbar.com, and if you go to downloads, everything that we use in every episode, they're all listed on there, and you can download them and keep them and look at them or whatever you want to do. So I'll make sure that's available on the site as well. But it was interesting that looking at a lot of comments that were being spread about by Chesterfield fans was the fact that, he wasn't particularly great at covering deep, and his defensive duties were kind of lacking a little bit. So I made it my mission to find a little bit of video of him covering deep when it looked like the opposition were on a counter-attack, and you don't blink because you might miss it, but here we go. So there he is, last man back. You can just about see him there, and he's cleared the ball. So he can do the defensive bit as well.
And it's that pace and power again, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Really, sort of
absolutely.
Like making sure that, and long strides and stuff getting back. And, he's a player that I'm looking forward to see particularly, because he seems to have had, so far so good anyway, a really strong pre-season. No,
definitely one that's probably shone quite bright in the early pre-season games. So the next one we're going to talk about, I think, is possibly the one that's going to create quite a bit of debate and controversy as the season goes on, and that's Ed Francis.
Yeah, I think Ed Francis. Before I get onto Ed, actually, just thinking about a nice link between Ed Francis and last episode where we had Ryan Boldy on talking about his book, The Dream Factory. I was lucky enough to receive my copy and had a read through, and there was a fantastic chapter, if anybody's interested, about getting the book, comparing Manchester as a landscape for youth development, and looking at Bury as they were as a league club, and the difficulties that they had in recruitment and retaining young players, and obviously the factory that is Manchester City, and the amount of millions that were pumped into it, and the amount of development those players had, and obviously Ed Francis would have benefited from that. And I think you can see that. You can see that when Ed Francis plays. I think Lee Curtis said it exactly the same, that you can see that he's had a fantastic upbringing, looks incredibly comfortable on the ball. I was really impressed. There was a passage of play in the second half against Boston where he received the ball off the back off one of the centre halves, but was being pressed by two players quite aggressively, and used both feet to kind of navigate those two players quite well. So much well that one of the Boston players didn't take too kindly to being shown up in quite the same way. And as Francis laid the ball off, he gave him a bit of a nibble in the back. And one of the things that I think was actually quite relieving to see as a Notts fan was he was quite happy to give it back, and there was a little bit of pushing and shoving from there. And when you consider his age, and when you consider the probable position that he's going to be playing, the amount of responsibility he's going to have, which is sat in front of the defence, that's a quality that you want to see. I think Notts fans need to prepare themselves that this is going to look very different to Michael Doyle's role that he played in front of the Notts defence last season, just because I think Francis is a good few inches taller than Doyle, and I think he, obviously with his frame, he doesn't necessarily have to move quite as energetically or as aggressively around the pitch. And probably, let's be honest, you probably don't necessarily want him to. If he's finding the right spaces, he's creating himself some time. But I did think that was a very obvious difference between Notts last season, where you would see Doyle really up and down, left and right, real sort of like energy, whereas Francis probably has less of that. And I think some of that is down to his size. I think some of that is down to the fact that he doesn't have to make quite as many strides across the pitch in order to do what he needs to do. But those moments of pressure, those moments of being pressed, those moments where he's had to go in and win the ball, I think he's done all of those, and I think he's certainly so far anyway from this very early stage, I think he's a very natural successor to Michael Doyle and the role that Doyle played so well last season.
That's interesting as well, because obviously the concern around that was more to do with the fact that he's played predominantly on a left-sided role, and he has been able to come inside on occasion, but not as much as he'd like to. And I think that was some of the issue last season for him as well. If I just bring up some, I'm sure I've got Ed's stats for last season here as well. So just to reiterate what you were talking about there, obviously his accurate passes, you're expecting to be high. But even though he was predominantly, in the games that he played last season, he was predominantly playing down the left-hand side. He was still getting a fair few defensive duels in, quite a high percentage on that. An aerial duels one, you might expect that to be a little bit higher because of his height, but then again, that's not necessarily going to be his game. So that fact that he's played mostly on the left, and then he's being given the opportunity to come into that holding midfield role that we keep talking about, Michael Doyle's role and what have you. This is where I think there could be some debate and controversy between fans throughout the season, because I still think he's going to need a bit of time personally to find that niche for himself in that position. I could be wrong. And I think this is where fans might get a little bit frustrated as well.
Yeah, no, I could understand that. And I think, a young player, I mean, I'm reminded of, players like Noor Hussin, who came with a very similar sort of background, someone who had been at quite a big academy. He'd been at Crystal Palace, hadn't he, and got on the cusp of the first team, and we'd kind of picked him up after a successful loan spell somewhere else. I think I'm seeming to think it was Stevenage, but I might have been wrong there. But obviously Notts then picked him up, and I think he got an awful lot of scrutiny and a lot of criticism for a very young player. And you're right. That there is the potential for that. I think the one thing that I would say is he seems a very sort of robust character. I loved his interview. I thought it was fantastic to listen to him, and his desire and his determination, for the club after the sort of the fantastic, introduction that he's had to the world of football through Manchester City and also through a spell at Wolves as well. So yeah, there is the potential for that. I think there is a chance as well for Doyle to demonstrate that nurturing element to him. I mean, one of the things that I remember when Griffiths got subbed off very early on in a game, I want to say away at Hartlepool, Doyle was in the stand talking to him, and you could see that, kind of coaching him through that. And I think that's where Doyle's really going to come to the fore and be able to kind of protect a player, playing that role for the first time, or certainly for a regular period of time, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final thing on Ed Francis as well. I'd got some conversation going on one of the internet forums recently about Ed Francis, where people were talking about the fact that other than his short spell last season in League Two, he's predominantly been playing for the either Man City and then Wolves, as you say. But he has actually been out and played in Holland a few games, I think, as well. And people were saying, I said, well, look, he's come through, with a very high pedigree. He's been surrounded by some of the best youngsters in the country. But even at under 23 level, when they're playing in that Premier League 2, for example, it's a highly competitive league. And even though they're under 23s, they have to be able to look after themselves, and you're hearing, well, it's different in the National League, wait till he gets a few elbows and, a few kicks and that. And I think the fact, going back to what you said earlier about the Boston game, and he was able to give a little bit back again, and it didn't faze him, it's something that's really good to hear, because that's what we need to hear. We need to know that he's not going to be daunted by this, that, everybody talks as well about there being sloggers and everything else as well in this National League. But my experience for 2 seasons of watching it now, or our experiences, are that actually there's not a lot of difference between this National League and League 2. Or even a little bit higher. And if you have a look at the quality of some of the players that are dropping down into the National League as well now, it just goes to show you that there is a desire within clubs in this league to play football, and to be able for Notts to be a club that can entice youngsters like Ed Francis and a couple others we're going to mention as well, is absolutely fantastic, and it's testament to the club as well. So yeah, I'm really excited to see how he develops over this season. I really hope he hits the ground running and makes that, that sort of holding midfielder is spot his own, really. So yeah, that'll be interesting. And then we can move on again, because another Man City development lad looks a very exciting prospect indeed in Aaron Nemain. What are your thoughts on Aaron?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I say, again, one of those players that I needed to do a little bit of research on in terms of looking at show reels, YouTube, those sort of things. And I mean, YouTube is awash with footage of this lad right from the age of kind of under 15s going forward. So we've picked someone up who really had the spotlight on him from a very early sort of stage. Obviously, we've signed him again, one of those players that Torquay fans are obviously delighted that we've been able to recruit. And I think, again, there's a lot, I'm starting to grow a lot of interest about trajectory. I think with the 2 players that we've just noticed, or we've just mentioned, I think it's significant that we're not their first club after academy football, because I think there is a difficult step to deal with, and there is a very different landscape moving out of academy football and into professional football. And I think it's significant, and in both cases we're not that first step. That they've gone somewhere else, they've tried it, they've had a season of it, probably learnt a lot, and then we're going to hopefully benefit from the things that they've been able to learn and develop from there. I mean, like I say, he's a player who looks to me to be, again, explosive, exciting. I think it's going to be very interesting how we fit all these sort of players into our system in that kind of attacking model. We've done, obviously, one of our earlier shows talk about Ruben. Obviously, we're delighted to see Karl Roberts return to full fitness, and obviously scoring as well in the game that he played. How Nemain fits in as well, it's going to be very interesting, fascinating to see. But also it looks a bit of a puzzle at the moment in terms of whether does he go deeper? Does he end up being a little bit more kind of out on the right, almost as a kind of right wing back, and thinking about what Taylor's going to provide on the left, almost as kind of like just deeper attacking players. But like I say, yeah, a fascinating player to recruit, and one that could really, go on some, and talking about what you were saying just before we switched onto this player, a player that you could imagine, or we would hope as Notts fans would be able to come with us again should we get out of this league, in the season to come. Absolutely.
I mean, I watched again another show reel, video show reel of Nemain, and of course it was all his best bits, so it made him look, quite impressive. But he is quite an explosive player. But one of the things that sort of came to me when I was watching him was it didn't, and I know we're probably talking, a massive chasm here between them, but if you watch Raheem Sterling, for example, and the way that he can play down that wing, but then also manages to find himself in the box at the right time in the right place, to get those knock-ins and what have you that he does. The videos that I watched of Aaron Lemaine, he wasn't too dissimilar in his style of play. He controls the ball and runs with the ball in a very, very similar manner to Raheem. I mean, obviously, he'd have been looking up to him as a youngster in and around that, Man City as well, and probably picking up some of those traits, if he was looking up at him. So, but that's where it gets interesting, because we're talking about maybe this right wing back role, and I think you're right, because then you've got him on the right, you've got Joel Taylor on the left, and then you've got that lovely 3 or a 2 and a 1, whichever way you want to look at it, with Cal and Ruben, who can both play a number 10 or a false 10 or whatever. And then, Carl Wootton, he's got to be absolutely, champing at the bit to get this season going with Cal one side and Ruben the other, but just looking at that, my only concern would be with Aaron, and again, the same concern that's been with Joel, is if he's playing that wing back role, is he going to be able to do the dirty work when it's needed, the tracking back and the deep covering, etc.? And that's something that we'll have to see. But it was also interesting when he joined us. I think it was Ian Birchall, actually, when he was talking about where he can fit in, and he did talk about that right wing back role and what have you. But he also mentioned about being able to drop into that number 10 role as well, which again is, just like Raheem Sterling does, and so it does then beg the question, how do we get all of these players, fitting into that structure that we're looking for and that formation? And it might be that we don't. I don't know. But it's certainly going to be very interesting to see. I mean, I've done a bit of a disservice because I haven't shared any of his stats, I don't think. But again, I'm talking about his defensive duties, and in actual fact, his second best stat for last season was his defensive duels won. So, that just goes to show you how much I know. But again, because of the style of play that we're going to be seeing with Ian Birchnall's knots, a lot of emphasis on the passing of the ball and making sure that those high accurate pass percentages are there. Again, you can see why the club have looked at Aaron Lemaine when you look at those stats there.
Yeah, and I think we can probably join it up with something that we've talked about right at the start of this show as well, the Knots' recruitment for a set piece coach, because this is a player who's going to draw fouls an awful lot. Yes. A fantastic dribbler from all the things that I can see, likely to be the target of the opposition, likely to be able, with that pace, to be able to kind of, get past a player and probably take a tackle. And so Knots' recruitment of a set piece coach could probably fit quite closely with, the recruitment of this player as well, who's able to kind of draw those fouls and be able to, thinking back to the Euros, for example, and the role Grealish played, obviously very different levels, but thinking about that role that he played of drawing those fouls on to allow those set pieces, to allow, England to attack in a particular way, and maybe Knots are going to use him in a similar way.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. So then we're moving on again, and I was really, really pleased with this signing. Comes with a little bit of baggage, I think, but I think he could actually be one of our star players this season, and that's obviously Matty Palmer. Somebody I have had conversations with on Twitter, who's followed Burton Albion a lot, said that couple of seasons he had with Burton where he was really on top of his game, he said he was absolutely fantastic, and considering that some of that was in the Championship as well. So to be having a player of his calibre and still only 26 years old coming into the club, again, speaks volumes about the appeal of the club as well moving forwards, and the aspirations that the owners and the rest of the management team at the club have got.
Yeah, and I actually tweeted Neil Cox, I think it was about over a year ago now, about kind of Palmer's availability, because I think he was at Swindon, wasn't he? And things weren't happening for him. And obviously I was aware of the local aspects as well, because I think he's from Derby originally. So, I was hopeful that Notts were able to try and perhaps recruit him, understanding even at that point that it would have been a bit of a long shot. So you're right, it's an absolute fantastic signing. But I think also it shows, again, another desire for Notts to give responsibility to these new players that's coming in. So whereas Cameron's worn the armband, which, like I say, whether he continues with that or not, that's a very significant early move to give a player who's quite young, who's coming into the side, that responsibility. Matty Palmer's also been taking an awful lot of the set pieces. So, again, Birchall seems to be determined to bring these players in and say, look, I trust you. I want you to play these crucial roles in our team. I think, we can link Palmer with Francis as well, and obviously we hope this isn't the case, but if that role of sitting in front of the back four becomes significant for him, becomes difficult for him, then obviously there's going to need to be somebody else who could play that role. And I think Palmer can do that. Palmer can sit in front of the back four, be able to kind of distribute, take the pressure off, should Francis need a rest or whatever.
No, that's a really good point. And again, the other thing that I'm really excited to see from him is Ian Birchall, again, talking about him possibly, yes, he looks like he's a replacement for Jake Reeves, but a bit more than that, because we're actually looking at a player who potentially is naturally a box-to-box midfielder as well, and that's something that we've been lacking at Notts for quite some time. So I'm really excited to see how that pans out as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like I say, I think he's got those qualities that Notts fans like to see in a midfielder. They kind of those energy levels and that determination getting onto the pitch and, like I say, going box to box. Because like I say, even though we did a show where we looked at the stats and we talked about how the stats don't necessarily stack up to the criticisms that Notts' midfield received last season in terms of their energy levels and those sort of things, I think we're going to see that that data go up even further with the dynamics in the midfield that we seem to have recruited in, because everybody that we've talked about, including the players that are still at the club, there's an awful lot of energy, there's an awful lot of ground to be covered, and those heat maps that we're going to find and going to see are going to be pretty impressive to look at, I think.
No, yeah, I'm looking forward to that for sure. So just looking at those that we've brought in then, Colin, in particular, that sort of holding midfielder and, those midfield positions. We talked about a few shows ago, before these signings were made, about a few guys that could possibly come in and make that sort of transition and drop into the Notts team in those positions for us. And, we haven't signed any of them. but interestingly, and credit to yourself as well, all of them have managed to get themselves some really good clubs. So maybe you just want to talk us through some of those.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that we have looked at some of the solutions on a previous show that Ian Birchall's obviously understood or felt that he needed solutions for. So Ben Stevenson, for example, has gone to Forest Green Rovers. Someone who I saw as being capable of taking on that kind of Michael Doyle role, but also being able to kind of play higher in the midfield should we need him to. Again, had those elements we would be looking for in terms of pass accuracy, etc. But he's gone to, like, say, Forest Green Rovers. Ben Fox as well, someone who, very much like Matty Palmer, offers that energy level, on that slightly on the right hand side, but gets up and down, really capable of doing that kind of role and those kind of responsibilities that you would need in that midfield and you would hope to see in that midfield.
Yeah, certainly somebody that we'll have to keep an eye on, seeing as he's joined Grimsby.
Yeah, and it's a 1 year deal as well, so there is the potential that if he does impress, and obviously one of the purposes of this show is going to be that we're going to try and track those players as long as possible, and just be able to see what sort of journey they go in. Interestingly, the role that we haven't filled as yet, and obviously there's been an awful lot in the press about the role of the striker, or finding someone that could play a role in taking some of the some of the pressure off Kyle Wotton, I suggested Tyrone O'Neill, someone who'd come from Middlesbrough, someone who I'd seen play National League North for Darlington, had done really well. And like I say, was surprised that Middlesbrough went, and there was an awful lot of reaction on Middlesbrough's Twitter that they were surprised that he was allowed to go. And he's ended up at Scunthorpe, which I think in terms of, I don't want to necessarily dilute that deal. I mean, it's probably no surprise because I think the agency, the SMI world that Notts used a lot, including Calvin Miller, who we've talked about earlier, that came through. I think there was a connection with Neil Cox, so I'm probably not surprised to find Tyrone O'Neill end up at Scunthorpe. But I'd become aware that he was one of the trialists. He'd scored on trial, and they've given him a deal. And like I say, fair play to him. I'll be watching what he does. Hopefully that he'll be able to kick on, because I think he's got that skill set that again would have supported Kyle Wotton and been able to take some of that load off. Because I mean, from the preseason games that I've seen, and particularly the Boston game, Wotton's doing that thing again, where he grafts, he goes down deep, he wins the ball, he won some fantastic tackles in order to turn possession over, and that's going to take a toll. That's going to take a toll on a player who's doing that for 40 or 50 times a season. So I think the hope is that we find somebody who's able to take some of that load from him. Good,
yeah, absolutely. So we had a chat this week. We were talking about a couple of players that are now available, both without clubs at the moment, that actually could be quite interesting prospects. Both of them offer quite a bit going forwards, but a little bit more than that as well. One of them will definitely be a name that Notts fans will be familiar with. The other one probably not so much, but comes with a good pedigree. So yeah, if we talk about the first one that you kind of highlighted, you'd like us to talk about tonight, was JJ Hooper.
Yeah, so JJ Hooper was someone who Notts actually had on trial, I think, under Kevin Nolan, because of the Newcastle United connections. JJ Hooper had developed. He isn't from Newcastle, but had developed. They picked him up quite early, and he'd spent a long time there. I think I'm not sure if he played a trial game or was certainly training. And like I say, he seemed a very interesting striker to have in and around the club even then, because one of the things that he offers, I think, is he offers a range of roles, and whenever I've seen him from that point, it's only strengthened those ideas further. I think he can play that kind of target man role. I mean, I think he's 6'1", so he's got the physical stature to play that target man role. He's able to hold up the ball really well, able to kind of protect the ball really well, but also has the pace and the energy to play as a kind of an outside sort of forward, cutting in. And I've seen him do that to devastating consequences in the National League. Someone who has been around an awful lot. I think probably his most sort of prominent spells were places like Wrexham. He was at Barnet recently as well. Scored an awful lot of goals, I want to say, for Bromley. I'm not quite sure whether that's true or not. I can't remember. He had a long spell and scored an awful lot of goals on a loan spell, I think. But also, I think he's still quite young as well, 26, 27, something like that. So again, we're not talking about bringing somebody in, for 1 year and trying to get a little bit out of them. But I also think, trying to do a bit of psychology here as well, this is someone who has played for clubs who and done well, in terms of context, for clubs who were mid-ranking or kind of up against it. Obviously his time against Barnet, scored a few goals in a team that was struggling when he played for Wrexham. Again, no disrespect to Wrexham, but it's not the Wrexham that we're becoming aware of now, spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on players or whatever. And he still scored goals in those difficult circumstances. I'm sure he would probably look at Notts as a fantastic opportunity to perform, hopefully anyway, at the higher echelons of the table, and Notts would be able to kind of utilise and channel that energy and that knowledge and that know-how, but be able to apply it either in 20-minute spells, maybe if Kyle Wotton needed a rest, or a midweek game, and we could rely upon him to to fulfill that role really, and he's still available. So I think he would definitely be someone that I would be looking at.
Yeah, the only alarm bells for me with JJ is obviously the number of clubs he's been at. He's played for a lot of clubs, and that kind of you always sort of think to yourself, what's the underlying reason for that? And he has got the ability to really sort of put a marker down, certainly in the National League, and it just worries me that he's without a club at the moment. And there could be lots of other reasons for it, but maybe I'm overanalyzing it. I don't know, but when you see a player that's been around a bit and is without a club, is that something you should be concerned about?
I think it'd probably be something to be concerned about if they were going to be your number one choice, because obviously you need reliability on a player that's going to be on the team sheet more often than not. What we're kind of looking for, and what we're kind of suggesting, is this is an alternative to Karl Robinson, or being able to kind of rest him in order to to bring in what we talked about on a previous show at the end of last season, to be able to give Karl Robinson that opportunity to rest and be able to kind of recover that energetic game that he does for not so well. But also, the effectiveness, thinking about that dry spell that Karl Robinson had, in the sort of mid to end point of the season, would he have been more effective if he'd have had someone to share that load? Yeah. And I think, obviously hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think he probably would do. And so maybe somebody like that could come in. But I also agree with you totally that, if there is, a reason for him to be without the club, then obviously Notts or anybody else should be looking elsewhere. However, one of the things that strikes that this guy just scores goals wherever he's gone, or very often. Yeah. And, there's not many people who've got a CV who can demonstrate that and can prove that. And so, like I say, having that as an opportunity on the bench sounds too good to be true for me.
Yeah. Here's some of his top career stats here. So 175 league appearances, 44 goals. His XG for those 175. So, he was expected probably to score a few more than he did, but it's not a million miles away. Again, successful passes, 74%. And he can dribble. He's comfortable dribbling with the ball as well. So yeah, he does look like he's got that all-round ability that we're looking for, and could definitely fit that role. The other guy that we've been chatting about before we came on air and have been the last couple of days is somebody that, since you mentioned him to me, I've taken quite an interest in, and I like him a lot from what I've seen of him. And that's Jacob Barkley Ajipon, or JBA as he's now going to be known, and as he's already known by his other friends and colleagues, I believe. So
we can stick to JBA if it makes it a lot easier.
I think so.
This is a player who, and again, little and fairly sad insight into my world, trawling kind of YouTube and looking for football post Euros, but before pre-season friendlies, was the Gold Cup in the US. And I stumbled on a few games of Grenada, and he played 3 games for Grenada. There was quite a few players in there who are quite familiar kind of football league players who qualify for Grenada. So that kind of, that was interesting. And then I think I became aware of a slide that showed that he was unattached, which obviously, grew my interest. And like I said, one of the things that stand out to me, and we're going to, you're going to be able to share some of the fantastic stats that you found, is he's someone who equally could play the Birchnell ball that we've talked about, and we'll continue to talk about throughout this season. Someone who is able to kind of pass successfully, but I think also it's someone who retains the ball really well, uses his body really well to protect the ball. No disrespect to Grenada, but they're not the biggest side at the Gold Cup, and they had to do an awful lot of ball retention, of protecting the ball, of making clever choices, and he seemed to consistently do that well.
Yeah,
I think also, thinking on like boring logistics, if Notts or if somebody else was able to pick this lad up, he's played 3 games already in the Gold Cup. This is not someone who needs, he's going to be doing any catching up in pre-season. He's game ready. So there's a kind of logistical point for him as well. But also, you talked about his caliber. This was someone who came through Crystal Palace's academy. I think it was the same intake as Wan-Bissaka as well. So, this is someone who's had really good grounding, but has played National League. I think he was at Aldershot 2 years ago as well. Yep. So this is someone who would come into a National League club or maybe even slightly higher and be able to do a job. But I think, again, offers more than just a slightly attacking midfield role, but actually can do the defensive stuff really well, can retain the ball really well, is clever, and it had to use that intelligence in the Gold Cup. So that's definitely somebody that stands out to me. What was it that stood out to you, Rich? What was it, the things that you liked?
Very much the same, but as you know, a very good friend of mine is actually on the board at Aldershot and is essentially the academy director. And when I started looking at JBA, after we'd had a conversation about him, I decided to give him a call, and we actually spent about an hour on the phone this week when I should have been working, just talking about JBA and the type of guy he is and everything else as well. And I just asked the question. I said, look, he's without a club. I know it's not your choice, but you know him. Would you take him back at Aldershot? And he said, without a doubt, he said, I would have him back tomorrow. Now, the only thing that he was concerned about was that when he was at Aldershot, he had issues with fitness, and it was always his hamstring. And the funny thing's hamstrings, aren't they? Because obviously with scans and things, you can see exactly how bad it is if there's a tear or whatever. But it seemed to be quite a regular occurrence that he'd got a problem with the hamstring. And there was some inference that maybe that was more to do with something that was going off inside rather than physically. And of course, he ended up going off to Dartford, which is also a little bit closer to where we think he lives and everything as well. Then all of a sudden, he hit form again. He was banging 90 minutes in game after game after game after game. Came back to Aldershot, 70 minutes, he was done again, hamstring in most games. So it's interesting to see that in the Gold Cup, he's been out there and he's been putting full games in and actually been probably one of the most influential players for Granada as well over there. And maybe all of that little bit of whatever was going off with his hamstring and on his mind or whatever is behind him. And, that strength and conditioning hopefully is back in. And if it is, I'd love for somebody to take another look at him and have a good look at him. I mean, I've found a little bit of video again. I'm not sure how much of this will play because I'm not sure how many seconds we're allowed to load. But this was him in the Gold Cup for Grenada against Qatar, and there was 2 elements of his game here that I just wanted to show very quickly. So we can see here, he's just receiving the ball here, halfway line, 1 player, 2 player, 2 more players, and a great ball. And very unfortunate that guy wasn't running fast enough on the end of that. And then here we are again. Literally, it just takes 3 or 4 players out of the game. I mean, there were 4 or 5 players around him then. Okay, maybe he should have hit the target there. But that just kind of gives you some indication of what his game's about and his ability. And like you said, it's not just about the goal scoring. His all-round game is obviously something that, needs a little bit more scrutiny, I suppose, because he's certainly showing signs of a player that could be quite accomplished and probably fit into the kind of formation and style of play that Notts are looking at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's an exciting player, and for me to be able to kind of initially pick up on that on a grainy YouTube feed and like I say, it'd be able to kind of be bore out by the stats. I mean, to extend the point further, I think he scored goal of the season at both, Aldershot and Dartford as well. So this is someone who would excite fans, someone who I think offers that. Well, we saw that in those 2 clips, but offers that potential for going forward. And like you say, playing 3 games back to back in the US and stuff certainly suggests that he's fit and raring to go. So I mean, I hope obviously that he ends up somewhere, but it'd be very interesting to see him in a black and white shirt as well, because again, we've talked about some of the fantastic options that we've already got in our locker room. Having somebody else who could do that and be able to, I was just thinking about that through ball and just having a Kyle Wootton or having Karl Robinson onto it. That would be ideal, wouldn't it? But like I say, just like with the players that we've talked about previously, Stevenson, Fox, O'Neill, we're going to be trying to keep tabs and keeping an eye on all these players and hopefully seeing them progress with the clubs that they end up with.
Yeah, absolutely. So here was his key stats here from his time at Aldershot. Made 49 league appearances, and they're not too shabby, those overall stats. And considering that the kind of feedback I was getting was that maybe he wasn't always firing on all cylinders. But just to reiterate something else that you mentioned back then about some of the cracking goals that he scored, that was one thing that was mentioned to me as well, was that he had really scored some fantastic goals while he was at Aldershot. And it kind of puts you in mind a little bit as well of a little bit of an Enzio sort of player there as well, who can make something out of nothing, which we saw in those videos there as well. But probably not as explosive as Enzio pace-wise and everything. But again, obviously showing he's got a bit of a footballing mind there, which is great. I mean, just as we move away now from that and what we've been discussing, just looking at a couple of the try lists and thinking about this striker that we're looking for. I don't suppose it would be beyond the realms of possibility that Notts will be offering some sort of, maybe, I don't know, season-long contract or whatever to Andre Wright. What are your thoughts on that?
I think he's grown in confidence, and stature as the fitness has increased, which I think will happen on pre-season. I mean, like I say, there's countless amount of times where I've got excited about a player that I've seen in pre-season who started off incredibly well, and then as the season's progressed has not quite hit those heights. So I think talk about trajectory. He seems to be building on those performances all the way through and becoming much more involved. I think it's a tough sell, if I'm honest. Whoever we bring in has got to accept that they're probably playing second fiddle to Kyle Wootton, either as a replacement striker, or is there a trick on in Burton's sleeve really to bring in and play 2 strikers alongside each other? I don't know, but I think it's a tough sell, and that's where you start to think, right, well, it's either going to be someone on a free transfer, probably for a year, to kind of bolster the squad, or is it going to be a loan? Is it going to be someone that we're going to bring in who we're going to offer games to, who they're perhaps not getting from their parent club? So it's an interesting one. Like I say, there's a danger of making a sweeping suggestion at this very early stage about whether we should sign Wright or not. But like I say, I've just been impressed that the performances from what I've seen have got better and better game after game. And like I say, I look forward to the remaining pre-season games because, hopefully, and again, obviously, typically as pre-season does, the challenges get harder and you start to see elements of their game that weren't there in the previous few weeks. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I mean, he's got the build. He seems to. He's looking like he's got a bit of hunger again, and I think that's probably coming from the environment within the club as well. You can see that with every player at the moment. It's in the interviews, you're seeing it out on the pitch, and all it takes is for all of these sort of little nuances that make a good or a bad season for a player to come together. And it could be the best thing that ever happens to him and Notts. It could be the worst, I don't know. Maybe it's not in the plans I don't know. But at the moment, with no one else on the radar from our point of view, it does make you wonder whether he could be a sort of last-minute season-long signing or something.
I think one thing is clear, that we're certainly taking a very different strategy to some of the clubs that we're in competition with in terms of certainly the striking department. Whereas there seems to be, obviously Wrexham was the big one, but also Stockport as well have gone out again and got an experienced striker. Not seem to be willing to kind of distribute that attacking threat across a number of players, and not necessarily bring in a huge marquee signing of a striker. And so some of those bigger names that I think Lee Curtis confronted Ian Birchnell with, I think it was after the Boston game. I can't remember. I'm losing my timeline now, but I think it was probably no shock for him to dismiss those rumours, because it certainly seems, you watch, we'll put this out there, and tomorrow we're going to end up splashing £1 million on someone. But certainly at the moment, it seems that we want to distribute that attacking threat across a number of players amongst the squad, rather than getting one focal point in, and investing heavily in that one.
No. Okay, yeah, absolutely. And just to finish off as well, any thoughts on any of the other trialists? Sheriff looks like he's being given an opportunity to impress. Is he taking that opportunity at the moment? Again,
like I say, it feels harsh to do it on the one game that I've seen full 90 minutes of, and obviously the footage. However, one of the things that I noticed in the Boston game was he played in that kind of defensive midfield role, and I don't think he looked too comfortable there with his back facing his own goal particularly, but moving him slightly more forward in a more natural central midfield position. He seemed much more comfortable, was happy to kind of drift out wide right as well, was able to kind of run with the ball a little bit. So we saw, he seems to be much more kind of someone more comfortable on the right hand side of that midfield. Do I think that we've probably got options for that position? Yeah, probably so. We've not
even as a squad player.
Well, I mean, it would be nice to see not perhaps recruit someone and then be able to kind of use the loan system to get them out there, to get them games until we need them. Because again, one of the things I was reminded of going all the way back to the Baseford game that I saw very recently was, Alex Howes, Declan Dunn were probably two players who needed some consistent loan spells in order to develop as players. And so, it might be that we'll bring one or possibly two of these younger players in, not necessarily as direct squad members at the moment, but actually we might be able to give them, games in National League North, for example, to get under the belt, for them to come in when the games come thick and fast and they're match fit. So who knows?
Excellent. Okay. Well, insightful as always, Colin. Thanks for that. Always very interesting to listen to your thoughts, and I really enjoyed that one again, this episode. I'm conscious of the fact that we're heading into 1 hour 10-minute territory, and so we'll probably call it a day for today on this episode. I just want to mention again to everybody, thanks for watching. If you can, please subscribe. Allegedly, you get a better user experience if you subscribe, so do that. You can obviously follow us on Twitter. There's Analysts Bar on Twitter, or myself at Notts County Stats, and Colin is Colin Sisson on Twitter. Just on the Notts County Stats side of things, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today, I've just finishing off a piece that I'll be posting just about the new signings. I was hanging on a bit to see if any more came in this week, but if not, I'll be lumping that out soon. So a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today will kind of complement what goes out in there. And again, just to reiterate, all of the content that we use, all of the graphics that we provide, and the bits of video clips and everything else as well, they'll all be available on analystsbar.com website in the download section. So of course, feel free to go and browse those and download them, do whatever you like with them, but they're there if you want to use them. So that's it then, Colin. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to episode 7.
Yeah, see you again.
Cheers.